Welcome to the Confessing Calvinist podcast. My name is Cedric Parcells, and I am the minister of the Word, otherwise known as the pastor at Door Christian Reformed Church in Door, Michigan, Door CRC. We are an Orthodox Bible-believing Reformed congregation here in West Michigan, and you can check us out online at doorcrc.org. We'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning or at one of our offerings during the week. This episode is, as you can see, about Synod 2022 and the church order, and that is because we have Synod next week. Starting up, Synod 23 is meeting in the chapel at Calvin University starting next week, and they are going to have a lot of work to do. They have to make decisions about all the stuff happening in the denominational offices. They have a couple of study reports that they need to take a look at. But far and away the most important decision they are going to make pertains to what happened last year at Synod 22. Full disclosure, I was a delegate to Synod 22, and I voted in favor of all the controversial decisions, even some of those that didn't pass. Make that of what you will. But there were several controversial decisions that we made, the chief of which was the decision to pass a resolution affirming that the word unchastity in the Heidelberg Catechism, in particular Heidelberg Catechism question and answer 108, does indeed encompass homosexual sex. And this was a big deal, because in the Christian Reformed Church, you can disagree a whole lot. You can disagree with synodical decisions normally all you want, as long as you act in accordance with them, and no one's going to stand in your way. But when it comes to our doctrinal standards, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, the Canons of Dort, disagreement is not to be tolerated. At least it ought not to be tolerated, especially among pastors and other church leaders, elders, and deacons and such. So when Synod 2022 said this word, unchastity, encompasses homosexual sex, things got real in our denomination, because it meant that many people either had to change their minds about the morality of homosexual sex, or they had to resign from serving in church leadership. And in some cases, that could mean resigning from their jobs. And so this is a very important decision, a big decision, controversial decision. And as a result, there are a lot of requests coming to Synod 2023 asking Synod to overturn what Synod 22 decided. And so we are going to be looking at some of the arguments that people have brought up against Synod 22, and which brings us to this group that calls itself All One Body. All One Body is an LGBTQ advocacy group in the Christian Reformed Church. They've been around since about 2011, and they have gone through all of the communications, all of the overtures to Synod 23, and summarized what they take to be the top 10 best arguments for overturning 22's decision. And they're very explicit that they are encouraging their members to hand these 10 arguments out to the delegates to Synod 23. They have a document they've put together, and they're hoping that the delegates will have these in hand when the topic comes up for debate, either in their advisory committee or on the floor of Synod, with the goal of overturning what Synod 22 did. Now, I've gone through each of these arguments. I've jotted down my own thoughts about their strengths and their weaknesses, but in this video, I would like to just go over my reasons for why I don't think their number one reason for overturning Synod 2022's decision is all that persuasive. And that argument is that Synod 2022's action violated good order, which is just a fancy way of saying that Synod 22 didn't follow the rules. And because Synod 2022 didn't follow the rules, Synod 23 should reverse 22's decision. That's the basic idea. But let's take a look at why they believe this. Why do they believe that Synod 22's action violated good order? And here it is. This is what they have done to summarize. This is their summary of the argument from all these overtures and communications that they have read. According to All One Body, by imposing a new interpretation on the Heidelberg Catechism and declaring that therefore this interpretation has confessional status, Synod 22 violated its own definitions and procedural norms. Further, proceeding to implementation without opportunity for review by the churches and classes and ratification by a future synod conflict with the church order, Article 29, that decisions of ecclesiastical assemblies shall be reached only upon due consideration. So that's their argument, and you will notice that this argument has three basic claims to it. First and foremost, they argue that Synod 2022 violated its own definitions and procedural norms, and they cite a report from the Acts of Synod 1975. We'll take a look at that in a moment. But then they go on to make two other claims. Second, they say that Synod 2022 proceeded to implementation without giving the churches enough opportunity for review of the decision. And they cite Article 29 in particular as their grounds for that requirement. Apparently, we did not give enough consideration to, didn't allow the churches and the classes to consider the position that we were deciding on, and so we were out of order. And then finally, they argue that Synod 22 made this decision without ratification by a future synod. So the idea here is that Synod was obligated to propose the decision that we made to Synod 2023 or even Synod 2024 and let that synod make the final determination. They don't cite it here, but this last argument, the one in orange, actually has more to do with another article from the Church Order, Article 47, which has to do with the procedure Synod is supposed to follow whenever it makes what the Church Order calls a substantive alterations to the teaching of the creeds and the confessions. And so we'll have to take a look at that Church Order in due time as well. So in summary, we can say these are the three claims that All One Body has put forward to advance their claim that Synod 22's action violated good order. And those are that A, Synod 22 violated its own definitions and procedural norms, in particular those having to do with Synod 1975. B, Synod 22 did not give the churches enough time for due consideration of the decision they were making, contrary to Article 27. And finally, Synod 22's substantially changed the teaching of the Heidelberg Catechism, and therefore it was required to seek the ratification of Synod 23 or some future synod per Article 47. It didn't, and therefore its decision is either out of order or not in effect. So those are their arguments. Now that we've got a grasp on those, let's take a look at each of these three claims to see what we can make of them. And let's begin then with this first claim that Synod 22 violated its own definitions and procedural norms that were adopted by Synod 1975. Now, to understand what's going on here in this, we have to go back briefly to the 1970s. I don't know if it was a disco era. I think it was a disco era. And so I'm going to ask you to just put on your disco shoes, and we're going to go back to Synod 1975. And what All One Body is referencing here is a report that 1975 adopted entitled Synodical Decisions and the Confessions. And according to this report, there are three levels of doctrinal authority in the CRC. The report was tasked with sort of describing what is the relationship between synodical decisions and the confessions. And they said, okay, well, to help us understand that, we distinguish between these three levels of doctrinal authority in the CRC. First and foremost, of course, we have the Scriptures. They are the only infallible rule for the regulating, founding, and establishing of our faith, Belgic Confession, Article 7. And so the Scriptures are the Word of God. We listen to God, and so they have, of course, our unreserved, wholehearted endorsement, what they teach. Underneath the Scriptures come our confessions. These are, in the Christian Reformed Church, considered to be true interpretations of the Scriptures, and so they also come along with that unreserved endorsement On our part, we not only have to live in accordance with them, but we have to believe what they teach. Finally, they say, underneath the scriptures and underneath the confessions come synodical decisions. And when the report talks about synodical decisions, it's important to note that they also included official interpretations of the confessions, or confessional interpretations. So the 1975 report argues that even synodical interpretations of the confessions are subject to the confessions. And as a result of this, because they say that synodical interpretations of the confessions are subject to the confessions, they have two important practical implications that they draw. The first is that no synodical decision involving doctrinal or ethical pronouncements, including a confessional interpretation, is to be considered on par with the confessions. They are not to have, or to be understood to have, confessional status. That's the first thing that they came to. This is a first piece. And the implication of that is that subscription to synodical decisions, including confessional interpretations, is not required of office bearers. So those are the two implications that they drew from their subordinating synodical decisions to the confessions. So what All One Body and the overtures they reference are arguing is that this 1975 report is still at play in the CRC. It establishes the protocols that Synod is supposed to follow in this regard. And so when Synod says that its confessional interpretation has confessional status, as it did last year, they're arguing, well, Synod 22 got that wrong. It's not the case that confessional interpretations have confessional status. It's a violation of Synod's own definitions and procedural norms. Now, that's a good argument in and of itself, but it has a couple of problems. And the first is that Synod 22 was not bound by Synod 1975. This is very clear if you read our rules for synodical procedure. Those are the rules that govern how Synod works. The rules for synodical procedure are very explicit, and I will bring that up for you. They say very clearly a succeeding synod may alter the stand of a previous synod. It may reach a conclusion which is at variance with the conclusion reached by an earlier synod, and in such cases the most recent decision invalidates all previous decisions in conflict with it. So the argument of the overtures that All One Body is summarizing here, they're correct. There is a conflict between 1975 and Synod 2022. But it doesn't matter, basically, because Synod 22 is not bound to agree with Synod 1975. Synod 22 has said, in contradiction to 75, that confessional interpretations do have confessional status, and since we've made that decision, all previous decisions in conflict with it have been invalidated. And so when Synod 22 says that that confessional interpretations have confessional status, that's just the case. They do. That's the first problem. Synod 22 was not bound by Synod 1975. The second problem that this first argument has is that Synod 1976 itself already corrected Synod 1975 on this matter of confessional interpretation. Consider this question. Given what we have learned about Synod 1975, according to 75, synodical decisions are subordinate to the confessions. Synodical decisions are accountable to the confessions, which means that if you want to know whether or not a synodical decision is right and good and beautiful and in good order, you need to go to the confessions and see what they have to say about things. But here's the problem. What if there's a disagreement over what the confessions say? Who decides what doctrines are contained in the confessions? And the 1975 report, interestingly, does not raise that question, and accordingly, it doesn't give an answer to that question. There might be a lot of interesting historical reasons why that question was not raised. But nevertheless, it wasn't, and it didn't give us an answer. Synod 1976, however, did see the issue, and it answered it. And the way they answered it was by the regulations that they put in our church order, under Article 5, in the supplement to Article 5. And this is what the Synod 1976 said about this matter. They said, no one is free to decide for oneself or for the church what is and what is not a doctrine confessed in the standards. In the event that such a question should arise, the decision of the assemblies of the church shall be sought and acquiesced in. In other words, the answer to the question of who decides which doctrines are contained in the confessions and which are not is Synod. And how is Synod going to decide which doctrines are contained in the confessions and which are not? Well, they're going to have to probably engage in some interpretation. So, contrary to the 75 report, not all decisions of Synod are subordinate to the confessions. There are some decisions, confessional interpretations, according to Synod 76, that do have confessional status. They determine what is contained in the confessional standards of the church. And so the first ground or reason or argument for all one body's main point that we acted out of good order falls away. Synod 2022 was not bound by the precedent set by Synod 1975, and what is more, Synod 76 itself had already overturned the most contentious element of that 75 report in our case. Now, of course, this does not mean that we can simply wash our hands and walk away. There's two more claims that are made in this argument, and so let's take a look at those arguments as well, those claims as well. And we'll start, of course, going down. We'll say this second one, and that is that Synod did not give the churches enough time for due consideration. According to all one body, this argument has to do with whether Synod 2022 met the requirements of Article 29 in our church order. This is Article 29. This is what it says. Decisions of ecclesiastical assemblies shall be reached only upon due consideration. So all one body's argument is that Synod 22 did not reach its decision upon due consideration, and in particular, the churches of the CRC hadn't had enough time to consider the proposal that of this recommendation that Synod 22 adopted, and to communicate their views about it to the Synod. And so because the church didn't give them that due consideration, it is out of order, or at least not in effect. It is hard to imagine, however, how this could be true. In the first place, COVID-19 ensured that the Human Sexuality Report, the HSR, from which this decision eventually arose, it was before the churches for 12 months longer than usual. Churches normally don't have that much time, but in God's providence, one way or another, you could say, the church had this report before it for a long time, and they could consider the recommendations that were being made in the report for a much extended period of time. So there's that, and then there's also the fact that the HSR recommendation and the eventual synodical decision, the synodical recommendation that was adopted, they're essentially the same. They're essentially the same. And to see this, all we have to do is put them next to each other and to compare them. So first we have this decision, or this recommendation from the HSR report. And this is the recommendation that Synod declare that the church's teaching on premarital sex, extramarital sex, adultery, polyamory, pornography, and homosexual sex already has confessional status. And then this is the decision that was adopted by Synod 22, and that has everyone hot and bothered. And that is that Synod affirm that unchastity in Heidelberg Catechism question and answer 108 encompasses adultery, premarital sex, extramarital sex, polyamory, pornography, and homosexual sex, all of which violate the seventh commandment. And in so doing, Synod declares this affirmation and interpretation of a confession, and therefore this interpretation has confessional status. Now, it's relevant to point out that one of the grounds that Synod had for this decision was that this recommendation, the second one, this recommendation is consistent, it said, with the intent of the first recommendation above, which was called Recommendation D. But what was the intent of the Recommendation D? What was the intent of the HSR recommendation? Well, it was, as you can see, that Synod declare that the Church's traditional teaching on homosexual sex has, present tense, already confessional status. In other words, while a few words are different, the proposition or recommendation they express are essentially the same. The difference between these two recommendations, essentially, is that the HSR recommendation above it is much broader, you might even say a bit vaguer. The Synod declare that the Church's teaching already has confessional status. What the second one does is it says, yes, you're right about that. It already has confessional status, and it's contained here in what the Heidelberg Catechism has to teach about unchastity. So, yes, there is a slight difference between them, but essentially they are the same recommendation. So it seems that we have pretty good reasons for disagreeing with All One Body's claim that Synod did not give the churches enough time for due consideration. COVID-19 ensured that the human sexuality report was before the churches for 12 months longer than usual, and the HSR recommendation and the eventual synodical decision were essentially the same. The churches had plenty of time to consider this proposition that was before us. Now, one possible counterargument that some people might make is that there were many delegates who had questions about how Synod 22's decision would be implemented or should be implemented. And since Synod 22 didn't provide those delegates with the answers to those questions, therefore Synod didn't engage in due consideration. In response, I would say two things. And I should warn you, there's going to be a bit of a rant going on here, so you have to bear with me here. First, this objection, this counter-argument, assumes that Synod must be able to envision every possible practical question that could arise for any decision that it makes. And that unless it's able to answer every practical question, then it's not giving a matter due consideration. But this is not feasible, it's not reasonable. No legislature can imagine all the possible outcomes of its decisions. It's simply enough that we have procedures for dealing with those unknown outcomes when they arise. And we have those procedures in the church order. In fact, that's what was said by the advisory committee at Synod 2022 when these questions were raised. They said those are good questions. We have a process for addressing them. It's laid out for us in the church order. So that's the first thing to say to that. It's an unreasonable expectation that we would have to be able to answer all the questions that were going to be addressed. In fact, most of them could be addressed just by reading the church order. Second, some of the practical questions that people have raised don't require a degree in chemistry to answer, right? You don't need to be a rocket scientist or a neurosurgeon to be able to answer some of these questions. So, for example, this year in their overture to Synod 2023, Classis Grand Rapids East asks, does this confessional interpretation and any given person's understanding of its meaning become a determining factor in who may be nominated for elder or deacon? The answer to which is yes, obviously. That's how confessional subscription works in the Christian Reformed Church. Does this confessional interpretation become a determining factor in who may be nominated for elder or deacon? Yes, just like the doctrine of election is one that is a determining factor in who may be nominated for elder or deacon. Or what your views are on church office are a matter for nominating someone for elder or deacon. When you become an elder or a deacon, the question is put to you, do you affirm all the doctrines that are contained in this confession? Yes or no? No? Thank you. We're going to put you on the waiting list. Yes? Wonderful. Great. We're glad to have you aboard. That's how confessional subscription works in the CRC. Second, they ask, do candidates for the ministry have to be asked about this specifically by synodical deputies, or is a person's overall adherence to the confessions sufficient? Now, I sort of feel like we're playing a little loose here when they say a person's overall adherence to the confessions. If you mean by that unreservedly affirm all the doctrines that Synod says are contained in the confessions, so if someone says, do you unreservedly affirm all the doctrines that are contained in the confessions? And they say yes, but you haven't asked them about whether or not they're in favor of same-sex marriage or not. Is that out of order? No, it's not. If the doctrine is in the confessions and the question is asked, do you affirm everything in the confessions? And the person says yes, charity requires us to assume that they believe that same-sex marriage is a type of unchastity. But in another sense, however, this is a matter of wisdom, isn't it? It's a matter of wisdom. So the question again, do candidates for the ministry have to be asked about this specifically by synodical deputies? Well, sometimes yes and sometimes no. There's all kinds of questions that aren't asked during a classical examination. I have been in classical examinations where the doctrine of election is never brought up. And it's only until the Q&A section that someone asks that question. And the Christian Reformed Church, last time I checked, took the doctrine of election pretty seriously. If we don't ask that question of every single candidate because we assume they believe it, why would we do it with this other one? Now, if I had someone in a classical examination and they had Arminius is my homeboy shirt on, I think it'd be appropriate for the synodical delegates or deputies to ask them the question of what their views are on election and reprobation and all those kinds of good things. Same thing would happen here. If you have someone who is got a rainbow pin, big rainbow pin on their lapel or something of that nature, and it might be appropriate for the synodical deputies to ask that person, is this like a statement about your views on same-sex marriage, or is this just you communicating how important the Noahic covenant is to us? That would be a matter of wisdom to determine. So again, this isn't brain surgery or rocket science, and I know they're really smart people over there in Grand Rapids East. I'm pretty sure they could come up with answers to these questions, and so we'll just leave it at that. We'll just leave it at that point, and let's end our rant. The rant is done. But the point is established. I think that the issues of due consideration were honored by Synod 22. People might have wanted more consideration, but by any reasonable standard or due consideration was given. So that means that we're left finally with this one last claim for all one body's argument that Synod 22 didn't follow proper procedure, and that is the claim that Synod 22's decision required another synod's ratification. That is, Synod 22 had the authority to propose that Synod 23 make this decision, but it didn't have the authority to make the decision itself. Now, if you read through Article 29 again, which we looked at earlier, you'll notice that this requirement isn't listed there. Article 29 says nothing about requiring a future synod to ratify last year's decisions. But this is just an oversight on all one body's part. The actual church order regulation they're referring to is Article 47. And this is what Article 47 says. According to Article 47, the task of synod includes the following: the adoption of creeds, of the church order, and of the principles and elements of worship. Synod shall approve the liturgical forms, the hymnals, and the Bible versions suitable for use in worship. No substantial alterations shall be effected by synod in these matters unless the churches have had prior opportunity to consider the advisability of the proposed changes. So, what's all this mean for this third point? Basically what all one body's argument is that Synod 22 didn't have the authority to implement the decision that it made, because Synod 22's interpretation of the confessions was a substantial alteration of the confession. Now, this raises the question, of course, what is a substantial alteration of a confession? And the good news is that we actually have something to help us answer that question, and it is the supplement to Article 47. And it answers this question for us. According to the supplement, to Article 47, a substantial alteration is any alteration which changes the essential meaning of the creeds. Changes the essential meaning of the creeds. So, in summary, what All One Body is arguing is that Synod 22 didn't have the authority to implement the decision it did, or it made, because Synod's interpretation of the Catechism changed the Catechism's essential meaning. And that means that this so-called change couldn't go into effect until a future Synod, either 23 or 24, or probably in their preference 2050, decided to ratify the decision. And since Synod 2022 didn't do that, its decision is invalid. So that's basically what they're going for here. The question then to consider here is, did Synod 22 change the essential meaning of the Catechism? Did Synod 22 substantially alter the Catechism by saying that the word unchastity in question and answer 108 and 109 and in 87 means or includes or encompasses homosexual sex? And to be fair, this was discussed at some length at Synod 22. And the advisory committee seemed a little at odds with itself over the question. At one point in the discussion, it sounded like the reporter for the committee was saying it was a substantive change. At another point in the discussion, the chairman of the committee said the opposite. And at another point, following more discussion, the chair of Synod, the person who was presiding over Synod at the time, clarified that it's not a substantive change. That's where we left it, sort of, as we went to debate it. Now, it won't surprise any of you who are listening that I agree with the chair of Synod on this one. I think there are two good reasons to think that he was correct. And the first of those reasons is that Synod did not change the essential meaning of the Heidelberg Catechism. We did not change the essential meaning of the Heidelberg Catechism. Again, according to the original recommendation in the Human Sexuality Report, the Church's teaching on these matters already has confessional status. That was what the Human Sexuality Report Recommendation D had said. It's already there in the confessions. The only significant difference between these two recommendations, the one from the HSR at the top and the recommendation that was eventually agreed upon, is that the 22 one on the bottom basically specified where in the Catechism this teaching was to be found. So Synod was basically saying that, yes, we agree with you, HSR report, it already has confessional status, and by the way, if you're looking to find out where it's at, go to question and answer 108. And remember, when the advisory committee brought this recommendation, the one on the bottom, to the floor of Synod, it said as much when they presented their reasons for their recommendation. They said in ground C, this is consistent with the intent of recommendation D in the HSR. And as we said earlier, what was the intent of recommendation D in the HSR? Well, we've already seen it. Its intent was to say that the Church's traditional teaching on human sexuality already has confessional status. So there's already good reason to think that Synod 2022 did not substantially alter the Catechism or change the essential meaning of the text. At least that's what Synod 2022 was claiming. It was claiming that this is already in the text, and so we are not changing the text. The essential meaning of the text is not changing. Now, some might say, well, we just disagree. We think that Synod 22 got it wrong, and they did change the essential meaning of question and answer 108 in the Heidelberg Catechism. And so Synod 2022 should have requested that Synod 23 serve as the ratifying synod. I imagine that most of the people associated with All One Body would probably agree with that sentiment. The problem with this response is what leads to my second reason for disagreeing with All One Body, and that is that Synod alone has the final authority to decide what the essential meaning of the Heidelberg Catechism is. So if Synod says that a doctrine is already included in the confession, then it is included, regardless of what I or All One Body or Classis Grand Rapids East or any other classis or any other person or any other professor at Calvin Seminary thinks. If Synod says this is in there already, then it is in there already. This basic approach is something that is simply stated in our Book of Church Order. And to see this, let's take a look at what the Church Order actually has to say about confessional subscription briefly to get the point here. So the basic approach is this. In section 1 of the supplement to Article 5a, which contains our doctrine, our process or a way of thinking about confessional subscription, the first thing that we're told is that the person signing the covenant for office bearers affirms without reservation all the doctrines contained in the standards of the church as being doctrines that are taught in the Word of God. And so all of us, I think, can look at that and say, okay, so every doctrine that is contained in the standards, I have to believe as an office bearer. Got it. But then in sections 2 and 3, we're told that in determining what doctrines actually are contained in the standards, the actual wording of the confessions itself is not entirely reliable. The actual texts of the confessions are not themselves per se the key to knowing which doctrines are and are not contained in the confessions. So for example, we are told here in section 2 that we cannot rely on the wording of the confession to tell us what is and what is not contained in the confession. Section 2, the signatory does not by affirming the confessions declare that these doctrines are all stated in the best possible manner. And furthermore, in section 3, we are told that a signatory is bound only to those doctrines that are confessed, whatever those are, and it's not bound to the references, allusions, and remarks that are incidental to the formulation of these doctrines. So here's the situation. In section 1 at the top, we have a very strong statement of adherence to the doctrines contained in the confessions. And then in sections 2 and 3, we're told that the words and the incidental references, allusions, remarks of the confessions, they may not be a reliable guide to know just what those doctrines are that we are to confess. The question then becomes, how then do we decide, or how do we come to know what doctrines are contained in the confessions? If the words are not reliable, if maybe the doctrine is stated in the best possible manner, how bad is it? We're not bound to the references, allusions, and remarks, along with any theological deductions that some may draw. Who decides how do I decide what doctrines are contained in the confessions and that I have to believe? Well, the answer that the church order gives us, as you can see at the bottom of section 3, is that you don't decide. You don't decide. The church decides for you. No one is free. The church order says, no one is free to decide for oneself or for the church what is and what is not a doctrine contained in the standards. In the event that such a question should arise, the decision of the assemblies of the church shall be sought and acquiesced in. In other words, who decides what doctrines are contained in the confessions? Who decides what is essential to the confessions and what is not? Who decides what is already there and what is to be added? Synod decides that. If Synod says that a doctrine is contained in the confessions, then it is. So if Synod 22, as I've argued, says that the Church's traditional doctrine on human sexuality is already contained in the confession, then it is. And per Church Order Supplement Article 5.3, no one has the right to say otherwise. Now, I know that some people might balk at that conclusion, and they will probably say that I'm just pressing things too far. And maybe, but I'll just point out this, that I'm not the first person to interpret the church order in this way. Dr. Harry Boer, in December of 1976, just a few months after this church order supplement was adopted, wrote an article in the Reformed Journal in which he said that this is exactly what Synod 76 had decided to do. So did Synod 22 change the essential meaning of the confession? Did it substantially alter the confession? Not in Synod's opinion. And when it comes to this, Synod's opinion is the only one that counts. So now we can go back to all one body's complete argument. We can go back to their complete argument. And in the course of this presentation, what I believe I have shown is that this argument is wrong. It's invalid. Synod 2022 did not violate its own definitions and procedural norms by going against Synod 1975. The Church had enough time for due consideration of what Synod 22 eventually decided. And Synod 22 did not substantially change the teaching of the Heidelberg Catechism. As a result, it was not required to seek the ratification of Synod 23, and therefore its decision is neither out of order nor without effect. Synod 22's action did not violate good order. Nevertheless, let me play with a counterfactual, if you will. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong that, in fact, Synod 22 did need the ratification of a future synod in order for its decision to go into effect? Well, in that case, I'd say, great, that's what Synod 23 is here for, isn't it? Isn't that, in essence, what all the overtures before us are essentially saying? Ratify or don't ratify, endorse or don't endorse. So even if you're not persuaded at the end of the day by the above, by the things I've argued, these grounds that all one body has provided, the grounds that are provided in these overtures, are not sufficient to overturn Synod 22. So I hope this has been helpful to you and interesting at the very least. It's given you food for thought and direction for your own study into these matters. And potentially, I suppose I'll see you at Synod. Even though I'm not a delegate, I'll see you at Synod in a week or so. I'll talk to you later.